There was a time when one empire stood above all others, stretching across deserts, mountains, rivers, and seas, ruling over millions of people from the borders of India to the Mediterranean, commanding immense wealth, powerful armies, and the loyalty of countless nations. And that empire was Persia. Long before Rome reached its peak, long before many of the great kingdoms of later history rose to power, the Persian Empire had already become the first true superpower of the ancient world. It was vast, organized, wealthy, and feared, a civilization that seemed unstoppable in its rise and unmatched in its influence. Yet, like every empire that grows too large, too proud, and too dependent on the strength of a few great rulers, Persia would one day face the slow birth of weakness and the sudden shock of collapse. This is the story of how the Persian Empire conquered the ancient world, how it built one of the most impressive systems of rule in history, and how even such enormous power could not protect it forever from decline, invasion, and destruction. Before Persia became a name that shook kingdoms, it was only one among many peoples living on the Iranian plateau, surrounded by older and more established powers such as the Assyrians, Babylonians, Medes, Egyptians, and Lydians, civilizations that seemed far more important and far more secure than the Persians could ever hope to be. But history often changes direction because of one extraordinary figure, and for Persia that figure was Cyrus the Great. Cyrus did not simply inherit a mighty empire, he created one through vision, ambition, and military brilliance. He first united the Persians and Medes under a single rule, turning what had once been divided peoples into the foundation of a much greater state, and from there he launched a series of conquests that transformed the political map of the ancient world. He defeated Lydia, one of the richest kingdoms of the age, and then captured Babylon, one of the greatest and most prestigious cities on earth. But what made Cyrus truly remarkable was not only his ability to conquer, but the way he chose to rule. Unlike many kings of the ancient world who relied entirely on terror and destruction, Cyrus understood that an empire made of many peoples could not survive through brutality alone. He allowed conquered nations to preserve many of their customs, religions, and local traditions, making Persian rule easier to accept and far more stable than the rule of many other empires. This policy of controlled tolerance gave Persia a strength that went beyond the battlefield, because Cyrus was not merely destroying kingdoms, he was absorbing them into something larger, something more durable, something imperial in the fullest sense of the word. By the time he died, Persia was no longer a regional kingdom with ambitions. It had become the dominant power of the known world, and the foundations of an empire greater than anything seen before had already been firmly laid. After Cyrus, the empire continued to expand under his son Cambyses II, who added Egypt to Persian rule, a conquest of immense symbolic and strategic importance because Egypt was not just another territory, but one of the oldest and richest civilizations in existence. With Egypt under Persian control, the empire now stretched across an astonishing range of landscapes and peoples, from fertile river valleys to dry plateaus, from ancient temple cities to frontier provinces full of unrest and military tension. Yet expansion brought new challenges, because the larger the empire became, the harder it was to control, and after Cambyses there was a dangerous period of instability that could easily have shattered Persian power before it fully matured. Instead, this moment of uncertainty gave rise to another giant of Persian history, Darius I, remembered as Darius the Great. If Cyrus was the empire's founder, then Darius was the architect of its greatness. He understood that conquest alone was not enough to hold together so much territory, so many cultures, and so many sources of wealth and conflict. Persia needed administration, structure, speed, taxation, communication, and control, and Darius gave it all of those things. He divided the empire into provinces known as satrapies, placing each under the authority of governors who answered to the king, creating a system that allowed local management while preserving central power. He improved taxation, strengthened the imperial economy, expanded the use of official administration, and most famously developed the Royal Road, a communications network so effective that messages and officials could move across huge distances with a speed that astonished the ancient world. Under Darius, Persia became more than a successful conquering state. It became a machine of rule, a disciplined and organized empire capable of extracting tribute, moving armies, and projecting authority over an enormous area. Great cities such as Persepolis and Susa reflected the grandeur of this imperial age, and emissaries from countless nations came bearing tribute to a court that symbolized wealth, majesty, and supreme power. At its height, Persia did not appear fragile or temporary. It looked eternal. But history is full of hidden weaknesses that often grow in the shadow of greatness, and Persia was no exception. The very size that made the empire magnificent also made it vulnerable, because controlling faraway peoples required constant vigilance, strong leadership, and an image of invincibility that could not be allowed to fade. Darius eventually turned his attention westward toward the Greek world, where city-states on the edge of Persian influence had supported revolts in Asia Minor. Persia intended not only to punish them but to extend its reach further into Europe, yet the Greeks proved more difficult to conquer than many expected. At Marathon, Persian forces suffered a defeat that echoed far beyond the battlefield because it revealed something the ancient world had hardly imagined. Persia could be resisted. Later, Xerxes I, son of Darius, attempted to restore Persian prestige with a far greater invasion, leading immense armies into Greece and achieving dramatic moments such as the victory at Thermopylae and the burning of Athens. But the campaign did not end in total triumph. At Salamis, Persia's fleet suffered a devastating defeat, and at Plataea its ambitions in mainland Greece were effectively broken. These setbacks did not destroy the empire, nor did they suddenly erase Persian power, but they damaged something just as important as military strength, the aura of unstoppable dominance that had helped sustain imperial authority. Persia remained rich, vast, and influential, yet its enemies had now seen that the giant could bleed. And once the image of absolute invincibility begins to crack, the political consequences can spread slowly through generations. In the years that followed, Persia did not vanish, but it began to change in ways that made its long-term survival more uncertain. The empire remained one of the greatest powers in the world, but internal tensions became more serious. Succession struggles weakened royal authority, ambitious nobles and satraps became harder to control, and court politics turned increasingly dangerous. A giant empire requires giant rulers to preserve it, and while Persia still had wealth, roads, armies, and prestige, it no longer consistently had leaders equal to the scale of the system they had inherited. The paradox of empire became clearer with every generation. Expansion brings glory, but it also creates fragility, because each new conquest adds people to govern, borders to defend, rebels to suppress, taxes to collect, and rivals to watch. Persia had become so immense that slowness itself became a weakness. Even with advanced roads and administrative systems, moving forces across such a vast territory took time, and distant crises could grow before the center was able to respond effectively. The empire had not collapsed yet, but the slow erosion had begun. Its power was still visible on the surface, yet beneath that brilliance the structure was becoming less unified, less disciplined, and less capable of meeting a truly extraordinary threat. That threat came in the form of a young king from Macedon, whose ambition was almost beyond belief. A man history would remember as Alexander the Great. When Alexander invaded the Persian Empire in the 4th century BC, he did not attack a weak kingdom in the ordinary sense. He attacked the largest and most prestigious empire of the age, a state with centuries of wealth, military tradition, and political legitimacy behind it. Yet Persia was no longer the empire of Cyrus or Darius at its strongest point. It was still massive, still wealthy, still capable of raising armies, but it lacked the unity, confidence, and strategic sharpness that had once made it nearly untouchable. Alexander moved with astonishing speed, defeating Persian forces at Granicus, then at Issus, and finally at Gaugamela, one of the most decisive battles in ancient history. At each stage, he exposed Persia's inability to turn its enormous size into effective resistance. Darius III, the Persian king, could not stop the momentum of the Macedonian advance, and once the imperial heartland lay open, the collapse came with shocking speed. Babylon fell, Susa fell, Persepolis, the ceremonial jewel of Persian power, was taken and later burned, becoming one of the most haunting symbols of imperial downfall in all of history. To the world watching, it must have seemed impossible that such a mighty empire could disintegrate so quickly, but in truth, empires rarely die in a single moment. They weaken quietly for years, sometimes for generations, and then one unstoppable force arrives at exactly the wrong time. Alexander was not the only reason Persia fell, but he was the final blow delivered to a structure already suffering from accumulated strain, internal weakness, and fading authority. So why did the Persian Empire fall? It fell because its territory became too vast to control with the same energy that created it. It fell because later rulers could not always preserve the strength, discipline, and legitimacy of the empire's founders. It fell because court intrigue and political rivalry weakened the center. It fell because enemies learned from Persian warfare and adapted. And it fell because when the moment of greatest danger came, Persia faced an opponent of rare speed, intelligence, and relentless ambition at a time when the empire was no longer at its best. Yet the story of Persia is not only the story of collapse, it is also the story of legacy. The administrative systems, provincial governance, royal roads, taxation methods, and imperial ideas pioneered by Persia influenced many later civilizations, including those that conquered it. Even Alexander himself adopted elements of Persian kingship and court culture, recognizing the sophistication of the empire he had defeated. Persia may have lost its throne, but it did not lose its place in history. Its power survived in memory, in institutions, in ideas, and in the civilizations shaped by its example. The Persian Empire rose from obscurity to dominate the ancient world, built a model of imperial rule that would echo across centuries, and proved that greatness can be both magnificent and fragile at the same time. In the end, Persia reminds us of one of history's deepest truths. No empire is too rich to fall, too vast to break, or too glorious to become a ruin. But the greatest among them leave behind more than ashes. They leave behind a legacy that outlives their kings, their armies, and even their final defeat.